You're listening to episode 273 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Beth Mulligan joins us to speak about how Dharma informs mindfulness-based stress reduction. Hi everyone. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to remind the listeners that there is another podcast which may also interest you. It's called Present Moment, Mindfulness Practice and Science. You'll find many of the same guests you've enjoyed and learned from here, as well as new researchers, teachers, and practitioners. You'll find the podcast in iTunes and can also visit the website presentmomentmindfulness.com. Thanks for checking it out. And if you like what you hear, please feel free to share it with others. In the past several years, there has been an astounding amount of press and research around mindfulness. And this has rustled some Buddhist feathers. Honestly, it rustled mine. I had a good understanding of sati, having sit several Satipatthana retreats with one of my dearest teachers, Bhante Gunaratana, or Bhante Ji, at Bhavana Society, and had continued my study and practice under the guidance of Bhante Siwali of Minnesota Buddhist Vihara. What was this upstart mindfulness-based stress reduction thing? How can an 8-week program possibly match mindfulness? Fortunately, I realized at least one of my many mistakes, that of ignorance. I may have had a grounding in one way of engaging with mindfulness, but knew nothing about what that program was doing and was judging it without understanding it. My ossified idea about mindfulness had led me into unskillful discursive thought, feeding my sense of privilege and ownership about this practice. I've since learned that the tradition can inform contemporary programs and still be doing something distinctly different, and nonetheless of value to others engaging with life. Beth Mulligan, PAC, graduated magna cum laude from Duke University School of Medicine Physician Assistant Program in 1982, and has practiced primary care medicine with diverse populations for the past 30 years. She is a certified MBSR teacher and international teacher trainer for the University of Massachusetts Medical School Center for Mindfulness, as well as a certified mindful self-compassion teacher and international teacher trainer. Beth has been a presenter at the International Scientific Conference on Mindfulness. She teaches MBSR, MSc, and mindful eating at the Susan Samueli Center for Integrative Medicine at Insight LA. The guiding Dharma teacher at Insight Community of the Desert and a longtime senior student at Yokoji Zen Mountain Center, she leads meditation retreats across the country. So sit back, relax, and have a nice lemon mint tea. Our guest today is Beth Mulligan. Beth, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Really happy to be here.
I am so delighted to be speaking with you because you're one of the folks that is on this podcast who lives in a couple of different realms, and we'll get to that. But I want to start us by having you tell us about your background.
Sure. I was drawn to some way of alleviating my suffering, I guess I would say my teenage angst, at a time when it actually was possible to be introduced to some of the teachings from the East. You know, I grew up in West LA in the 60s and 70s, and my high school English teacher handed me a book by Ram Dass. I think she had a sense of how much I was struggling with my family life. And I right away found some thread of truth, of something that felt like, oh, there's some other way of looking at life that I didn't know about, but that gave me hope. It gave me a sense of possibilities. And it just resonated. I hadn't grown up with any religion, but there was something in that book. It was the Be Here Now book. And she loaned it to me and I had to give it back to her. And, I used to read it on the school bus and I started a practice by myself. And then later, as I was, continuing, I went on to go to medical school and become a board certified physician assistant. So I was dealing with science primarily and human suffering in the realm of medicine, but hadn't really completely addressed my own suffering, even through things like therapy and good friends and community involvement. And a young friend of mine strongly suggested that I read this book by Thich Nhat Hanh called Peace is Every Step. And I had already had a yoga practice and I had been kind of dabbling on my own with Buddhist meditation, but hadn't really landed anywhere. That book opened another one of those windows, like the Ram Dass book, where I actually started to apply everyday mindfulness, which he suggested through simple things like when you're cooking, just cook. When you're washing your hands, just wash your hands. And the relief I found, even though it might not have been lasting relief, was really, really striking. And it piqued my interest enough that I went and I did a 5 or 6 day, I think it was, silent retreat with him and his monks and his nuns. And it was powerfully transformative for me. And I came back from that with this sense of approaching a way of giving through medicine, through teaching yoga, through teaching meditation that was so different than this paradigm I'd been working with where my ability to give to others seemed to run out and I would suffer from burnout pretty quickly. And something about that retreat introduced me to this resource that was ever renewable or replenishable, if you will. It's hard to put exactly into words, but it was so different, such a different feeling. And is what really led me to get serious about my practice. And I found a local Zen center and I found a teacher and I began to get involved in it and attend regular retreats there. And I live close enough. I mean, it's still about an hour drive for me, but I can go every Sunday and participate in the program and volunteer there. And, it's just become my second home away from home for the last, maybe 18 years. And I've had the opportunity, because it's a residential monastery here in Southern California, to live there for 3-month training periods. And it's just sort of taken over my life. And at the same time, I'm just very much leading an ordinary life with a job of seeing patients and living with my partner and being a householder, having my dogs. And at the time where we live in the mountains, we don't have television, but I was scanning the shelves at my local library and I saw this series called Healing in the Mind that Bill Moyers did through PBS. And I was really interested in it. It was a 6-part series. And the one part that really captivated me was the part about John Kabat-Zinn and mindfulness-based stress reduction. And I checked that video out over and over and over. And I finally bootlegged a copy of it. Don't tell anybody, but I just saw John teaching patients that looked like my patients in a hospital conference room that looked like my hospital, suffering from the same kinds of things and doing the things that I was doing in my own life for my own healing. And there was this sudden realization that these worlds that had been very separate for me, medicine and meditation, that there was a way to bring them together. And I know many, many health professionals who've had that experience. I know I'm not alone there. So at that point, there wasn't internet or anything. I dialed 411 and tracked down UMass and found out about professional trainings. And I went and did my first 7-day training with John and Saki. And I began teaching MBSR at my local hospital through their patient education branch. And then at the cancer center, and it just kind of grew from there. And right from the beginning, Ted, I never felt there was a separation between my Buddhist practice and MBSR. I didn't feel it was different or separate. I didn't make that distinction in my mind. I know as many people do. I guess I'm a joiner, not a splitter. I don't know. But that was really my journey. And those two worlds have peacefully coexisted, for many years.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And it's just fascinating to hear that there's a convergence. This was not a separation. This was not a something that was in conflict, but it was part of your practice. There was no conflict between the two.
Yeah, for me, there wasn't. I saw the Dharma was deeply embedded in MBSR. I'm not super attached to concepts or names or dogma or particular curricula. So it was just a really good fit for just who I am as a person. Inside out, this, what John calls inside out learning. I'm sure he's not the only one that's used that term, but that is just a really good fit for me. When you practice medicine, you spend your day trying to tell people what to do. And it actually is not very effective most of the time. I mean, they politely listen and then they do what they do and they come back and you have the same conversation about their diabetes or their cholesterol or their knee pain and there's a lot of learning to just love people as they are. And there's also a certain level of frustration and being in this expert role with the kind of the wall of the white coat and the stethoscope and this professionalism. And so I know because I train MBSR teachers that for some people that role is very hard to let go of. Well, I couldn't wait to let go of it. I was exhausted by it and also saw the certain amount of ineffectiveness of it. Although, at times it's completely called for. And I'm super grateful for the education I had and that some of the expertise that I had. And I know that I helped people. But as far as the role and the whole paradigm, stepping into that MBSR classroom where I did not really have to know or fix or answer questions was a profound relief for me. And I know working with teacher trainees, for some people that's a real steep climb. For some people it's a gentle climb. And for some people like me, it's no climb at all. It's like all downhill, in a good way. Just like we're going to sit in this circle and be together in not knowing and discovering and finding out, practicing and reflecting on practicing and practicing and reflecting on practicing. And what's so nourishing and meaningful and inspirational to me is hearing each person's wisdom emerge. As I'm sure, you know this because you do the same thing. And this is exactly what the Buddha was talking about. It's exactly what he was talking about.
Right. I'm always amazed when we have a program and we may even explicitly say the teaching happens in the middle of the circle. It's from you and you and you and you. That's the heart of this. It's from the heart. It's from your own experience. And that really bears out, even just from the very beginning, how people connect and learn from one another rather than here's the list of stuff you got to memorize. It's not that.
Exactly. And I felt like letting go of the top-down learning was such a relief to me to be just part of the circle. And I knew that I had a great responsibility on the one hand to really create that safe container, which we're taught to do. I had a lot of support behind me in terms of how to do that. And certainly the professional trainings offered through the UMass Oasis professional training branch, set me up really well to do that because it's not something you learn in medical school. And I also saw it modeled particularly by my Zen teacher, who is incredibly skilled at drawing wisdom out of the participants and people that were my MBSR mentors like Melissa Blacker and Florence Melio Meyer and Saki and John, the modeling of the non-expert, non-top-down learning. I reveled in it. I really like it.
Yeah, it's one of the joys, not to be on that sometimes a bit sharp mountain seat.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, last night I taught a drop-in meditation group, and we practice together for about 40 minutes, and then we reflect on what came from the practice. And I was just astounded by what people came to from sitting quietly together for 40 minutes. I gave a little bit instruction at the beginning. I invited an intention. The intention last night we were working with was not knowing, which is both, in the Zen tradition, there's the koan about not knowing is most intimate, this dialogue between a Zen teacher and a student. But then it's also one of the attitudinal foundations of mindfulness, of beginner's mind.
So it's fair to say that you live, it sounds like, comfortably in the traditional realm as well as within contemporary mindfulness.
Yeah, I do. I don't have a lot of attachment. Like I told you, I'm not someone who makes a lot of divisions, unless I see something really unskillful or that's been, put in a box. I don't really look for that.
So let's segue a bit. Let's talk about the book itself. What prompted you to write this particular book at this particular time?
Well, I have to back up a little bit if that's okay. One of the highlights of my year, up until recently was every year the UMass Center for Mindfulness offered this international scientific conference on mindfulness in medicine and society and healthcare. And I loved going to the conference, not just because of the content, because of the interpersonal connections. It was just a feast of sangha, of connection. And one year, researcher Paul Grossman gave a talk that was very impactful for me. He was looking at some of the ways that we measure mindfulness in the research, and particularly a scale measuring mindfulness. And he felt that we were a little bit off track in trying to measure mindfulness. His feeling was that we should engage people in practicing mindfulness and then measure effects in other things, but not try to measure mindfulness itself. And what he pointed out was if you look at the questionnaire, it's really talking about attention and attention training and how much or how little you're paying attention. And then he ended his talk by saying, mindfulness that is not grounded in the four immeasurables is not mindfulness. And it was like something went off in me at that point, like a little flower or seed was planted. And I went home and I thought about that a lot because I realized that as mindfulness has evolved and become more popular and is offered in different ways and obviously being measured in different ways, that this emphasis on the mind and attention training had become predominant in the field. And what he was pointing out, whether you know or don't know what the four measurables or Brahma Viharas are qualities of the heart and attitudes, and that this needed to be really deeply included in the way we teach, practice, and talk about mindfulness. And that it was starting to drift into much more of a attention training. I wouldn't say, at any point UMass or MBSR in its original form was drifting, but as other versions and other types of trainings and other types of measures were coming out, this emphasis on mind and attention was becoming predominant. I don't know if you have felt that
No, I
way.
agree completely with that assessment from Paul, because it is interesting, because in the trainings that are done at the center, where I also got my MBSR teacher education, it's absolutely not attention training in the same way that it's absolutely not relaxation. That's not what we're doing. It may seem very nuanced and subtle from the outside, but that was a very insightful observation that Paul shared, because there were, I think, as we were looking so closely, because with research, it does involve getting up close like we do with the breath. And as we do, when we look at the breath, the rest of the stuff kind of goes into the background. And that may have been occurring as we really try to wonder, well, what can we measure? Attention might be something, and here's ways you can do it. But the heart. And so how we bring that into the fold, I think, is one of the challenges that we face in the scientific study of the way of living life of mindfulness.
Yes, exactly. So what happened was that kind of worked on me, it just sort of that lived in me as a koan, and which is in the Zen tradition is kind of like a puzzle or a teaching. And I started to really explore, actually learn more and practice more in the Brahma Viharas, which aren't typically part of the Zen tradition. And what that led to, Ted, was a few years later, I decided to offer a workshop at the conference. It was called Exploring the Buddhist Foundations in Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. So I had to work a lot on that, and I decided to choose the three refuges, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and talk about how that is part of an MBSR class without being explicitly named, and talk about the Brahma Viharas and how to practice those. And of course, there could have been many, many Dharma doorways that could have been part of that workshop. And I was not the first to do that. Melissa Blacker and Bob Stahl had been doing similar day-long workshops at the conference, similar, but different. And so what happened was I continued to teach that workshop in different settings, and found that what was interesting is that not just MBSR teachers who, like the newer generation, are not coming through the Dharma door as perhaps you and I did. They're coming from clinical fields. They really don't know much about the Buddhist teachings or the Dharma. And they were really interested. They were really hungry for it, especially if it was presented in such a way that there was no agenda about them becoming a Buddhist. As my teacher always says, the Buddha wasn't a Buddhist. But to say these are ancient teachings that have really stood the test of time. But what was equally interesting to me is that there were long-term Dharma practitioners who were really, really interested in this workshop, because they were in that camp I think you were talking about earlier that felt like something was really missing in the contemporary mindfulness offerings. And you could almost see like a sense of relief, like that they had felt conflicted in their MBSR teaching. And suddenly it was like them coming home to something. And they would come up to me and thank me, which was surprising to me. It wasn't the audience I thought I was reaching. And as a result of those workshops, I was contacted by a publisher. So to say the seed of this book was in me, it actually wasn't. Although it was, because I was writing about it and I was teaching it, and I was reflecting on it a lot. And as I continued to become an MBSR teacher trainer through Oasis, I really started to see this gap more and more. And so I felt more impassioned about it, as I suspect other people do as well. I know I'm certainly not alone there. And so when New Harbinger did I guess they did a web search and they came up with a workshop and they approached me about writing the book. And of course, my first reaction was, I'm not equipped to write this because I'm not a scholar. I'm not a Buddhist scholar. And they use terms like Buddhist psychology, which I probably do know what it means, but I would never use that term because I really come from the clinician practitioner point of view, not the scholar point of view. So I told them, well, I didn't say, listen, I think you should probably ask so-and-so to write this book because my partner wouldn't let me. I think you should give this a shot. They asked you. So I thought about, well, how would I write the book as me and what I bring to the table? And so the answer I came up with was to write about exactly what I'd been reflecting on, which is to look in my MBSR classes that I was teaching for the way the Dharma showed up naturally. And so I wrote them and I said, I can only do it like this. First of all, I'm a storyteller. I've been telling stories a long time in my other writing and come from a family of storytellers. Second of all, I can't give you all the Theravadan lists. Third of all, I really want to make this come alive. I want it to be a living Dharma teaching. And much to my surprise, they said, great, that's really interesting. So I said, listen, I want to take the reader into an MBSR class, talk about the class. I may talk some about my day in the clinic, and then I will unfold the Buddhist teachings that I see unfolding in the class. And again, they went, sounds great. So then, in order to get the contract with them, I had to write quite a bit of material. And I wrote an introduction in 3 chapters, very much from this very personal storytelling point of view. And again, I'm waiting for them to say, nah, no, we really want, lists and boxes and bullet points and how-tos and that isn't how I think. It's not how I write. It's not how I teach. But they liked it. They really liked it. So they sent me a contract. Now, before I did anything, wrote a word, I wrote to John Kabat-Zinn and said, I've been approached about a book about the working title, Dharma of MBSR. What are your feelings about this? Because it's really daunting to undertake writing about someone else's life work. I felt that responsibility very heavily, and I was totally prepared for him to say, please don't do that. But that is not how he responded. He was quite supportive. He said, I suspect there's going to be a number of books like this coming out. And he's right. There are. I'm not the only one writing about it. And he said, it might as well be you. So with that, then I went ahead, and that's how it came to be.
It's fascinating. These Dharma gates are endless. I vow to go through them. That in so many ways, I've seen the same thing, that many people coming to mindfulness programs and teacher training are not coming through a Dharma door. They're coming from a clinical aspect. They saw a Time magazine or 60 Minutes or something like that. And in a way, it's like having a clean slate. There's no unlearning to do. There is no conceptual adjustments and hurdles that need to be overcome that I struggled with a great deal when I first started on this particular aspect of that journey. And at the same time, within the Dharma community at Barry Center for Buddhist Studies on a retreat with Stephen Batchelor in the past couple of years. And the question about mindfulness programs came up, and it had the note of concern by the person asking. And Stephen was very supportive and positive about them. And he asked how many people here teach in that context, or MBSR teachers perhaps. And I was really pleasantly surprised that it was about half the room raised their hands that were there. So it's going in, and I think this is speaking to your own way of engaging, that this is big tent. These can be complementary and they don't need to be anything else. So you also brought up being a story writer, and that leads to something that I wanted to ask about that you touched on, is that this book is a little different from others that the listeners to this podcast typically hear me talk about, in that the people perspective you use throughout. You tell stories. This has more conversational writing in any book of its kind that I've seen before, and I'm wondering why you made that writing choice. If you could talk just a little bit more about that.
I'd be happy to. One of them comes from sitting through probably thousands of Zen Dharma talks, which always start with a story. And my teacher, he's not unique. Of course, I think he's special, but one of the gifts is taking these ancient stories, dialogues between teachers and students, or students. And at the first pass, you think, what the heck are they talking about? And then his ability to make it alive and real in our lives today, and to draw that out of the group. What do you think they're really talking about? I have found to be such a valuable way of learning. And actually, storytelling, we know from current research, but also from ancient times, is one of the best ways that people learn. It actually lights up certain parts of the brain. We take the information in a certain way, and it's a very valuable powerful way of learning, and it's one of the most human ways of learning that we have. And also, it's just my personal preference. It's my personal style. It's how I like to learn. The other thing is that because the people who I call my students have been such powerful teachers for me, I felt, why not let them do the teaching so that it's really clear, just as you and I were talking about in an MBSR class, that this is not a top-down, Beth Mulligan's version of MBSR and the Dharma, but these are lived lives of people discovering the truth, their wisdom for themselves. That's a big part of why that style. And also, Ted, to be honest, there wasn't another book in me. And I made that really clear to the publishers. It's like, either this is the book. If you want this book, this is the book I can write. If you're looking for something else, you really need to go elsewhere. I didn't have like another option.
Well, and I think that ties to the integrity aspect that you and I were talking about before we started the conversation tonight, is there's an authenticity to doing it that way because it's from lived experience.
And it also made it really fun because I got to revisit so many meaningful moments in my classes and remember such courageous, wise, wonderful, funny people that had touched my life. And it was like being with them all over again. And it was, the writing of the stories was the really pleasurable part. Writing a book is very difficult, especially when you're dealing with editors that you don't know, and timelines and deadlines and opinions. And it's also, not only is this book different perhaps for you and your audience, but it was a very different type of book for New Harbinger. Most of what they do are self-help workbooks. So there's a little tension in the beginning to make it clear that this was not going to be that. And that was one of the things John specifically encouraged me to do, was he said, please don't turn this into like a paint by the numbers book. And I wouldn't do that anyway. But I think that's really where the storytelling element comes from. But also, both my parents were more in the creative arts. So I grew up around wonderful storytelling and art and theater, and literature. So even though I have this science part of my brain, my heart really belongs to that realm.
I get it. I get a theater background too. So thank you for saying it. So Beth, what's your aspiration for the book? What do you want to have readers get from this?
I'm really glad you asked that. And it comes back to what we were talking about with the emphasis or drift, if you will, on attention training on, oh, this can enhance your performance or your business. It feels to me, Ted, now more than ever, if I wanted to emphasize two things in the book, one would be the connection to the heart qualities of love and compassion, of the ability to feel joy for other people, generosity and equanimity, but also the ethical foundation on which all of this rests. Because there's been some criticism about that, and it felt very important to me when I found myself writing in chapters 6 and 8, where I was talking about the ethical factors of the Eightfold Path, to really make that connection very strong. And that, if I could sum it up really quickly, was to make sure that the reader understood or felt a personal enlivening, if you will, of their own heart and their own ethical values, and realized that this practice, as you said, as important as it is, isn't just about health benefits or a bit of relaxation or where you place your attention, but to really get the vitally important aspect now, a practice that keeps us connected to our heart and our core values and our ethics. And in the age of distraction and in the age of the speed that we're going at and in the political climate, this feels very, very compelling to me and very urgent and very important to me. And I tried not to do that in a preachy way, but it was an incredibly important aspect of the book for me. So if I were to sum it up very quickly, it would be to say that the heart and ethics of mindfulness are clear and invited into the reader's life, to say, take some time to connect with your heart and your ethics and see how that can actually become a lived practice for you through Sangha, through connecting with other people.
Yeah, it's interesting that right now in a sitting group that I'm involved with, an in-person group, that over the course of these few weeks, we're exploring ethical behaviors, ethics. And we're just this week, we're talking about top-down ethics. The rules say this versus, and there was an individual in the circle, in the group, who did this beautiful gesture where she had her hand and held it in front and just lifted it up, through her heart as a way of expressing ethics that come from within. And the example we were talking about with that was a recent airline encounter that many people may recall, where top down was a large organization feels, at least, that they had a legal rightness, a top down, to take the action that turned out to be very harmful. And that's a very different thing than had the people involved been more connected with that heart, that arising, that opening of what's the right thing to do here, would have gone in a very different direction. So one of the things I said at the beginning of our discussions of that weeks ago was, I always get a little leery of lists because it's so easy to use those in a way and lose that connectivity in the same way that we may lose connectivity with, mindfulness as attention measurements only. It's more than that.
And what's so interesting, Ted, and I know that you've seen this over and over again, is that when we get quiet and we get still and we start to bring more awareness to our lives, we can actually feel the pain of the world more acutely. And Gil Fronsdale, a wonderful Dharma teacher, uses this term ethical sensitivity. Our practice does, in fact, make us more sensitive. And I feel that sometimes allowing ourselves to feel the pain of when either we ourselves get off course or others do, and not numbing out and not being so distracted that we don't feel that, brings us back in an organic way to our ethical compass, because we're not numbing out, because we are aware and we are feeling the present moment. And it also can be ignited, if you will, our connection to our ethical or value center by being more in touch with our hearts and feeling more compassion, connectedness, and love. And that it isn't a commandment, but it actually stems from this connection of, I am really not so separate from my other human travelers or my animal travelers on this earth. And therefore, knowing that and feeling it, not just knowing it, but feeling it in my heart, feeling it in my body, I want to behave in such a way that I cause less harm, not only cause less harm, but can be a benefit. And in these ways, being truthful, non-killing, refraining from intoxicants, being appropriate with sexual boundaries and behavior. Those are some of the ways known across cultures, across wisdom traditions, to help people cause less harm. And the way it's phrased in our Buddhist precepts and our teachings, in fact, aren't this top-down imposed commandments, but a way of, usually the way it's phrased is, I undertake the training to practice honesty, or I'm willing to cultivate a heart of generosity that doesn't take what isn't given.
It's not so very constrained and restrictive. It's a way to nurture the arising of these qualities.
Yeah, beautifully said. Exactly. These, and to bring us home again and again to our true selves when we just get enough stuff out of the way.
Usually that stuff being us.
Or, conditioning, and I would say more than ever now, just the sheer pull of the distractedness that our technology has created, and the pace at which we live, and just how much input we take in. Judd Brewer in his TED Talk, I love this one line that he uses, which it's so much like what the Buddha said on his night of awakening, which he says, you're already awesome, just get out of your own way. And I would just rephrase that as, we're already wholesome and ethical. We just need to get some things, as you said, sort of undone, as opposed to doing more.
You mentioned Gil Fronsdal, and I hold in my hand a copy of his new book, The Buddha Before Buddhism, his translation of the Atthakavagga. So I hope to have Gil back on the podcast. He's been with us before to talk about that. So folks who are listening, stay tuned. We'll bring that in. Beth, I wanted to ask, maybe just one more fun, rich topic for us is, when doing a program, I will often find that the participants will, just through their own practice, their own experience, uncover and articulate a deeply known aspect of Buddhism, even though it's their human experience. They've had no encounters with the tradition before, that it's not a privileged, owned only by Buddhism kind of thing. I'm wondering if you have a favorite story about that, or if there's a particular Buddhist concept that tends to arise in your programs, even when the participants might not be aware that, oh, there's a background on this.
The first thing that comes to mind that kind of lights me up is the teaching around non-self, where the Buddha described the three characteristics of existence: impermanence, suffering, and non-self. And I feel like impermanence and suffering are talked about a lot. But what I so appreciate seeing in unfolding in the classes is, in this teaching on non-self, the Buddha didn't say there isn't a self. He just said, if you look for one, you won't find it. And the way we often phrase it in at least in our Zen center is no fixed self, or no always like this self. And watching people come in with these ideas about who they are and what their limitations are and their roles. There's a whole chapter in Full Catastrophe Living that I love called Role Stress, which is, I think, a very deep source of suffering for many people, being confined to a particular role. And watching people start to see themselves as much bigger than they thought they were, and also much more fluid and more flexible. Even in the day-long retreat, people come and they say, well, I'm someone who could never keep quiet for a whole day, or this is something I would never do, or I'm someone who always does this. And then they don't do that. They do something completely different and they surprise themselves. And that grip of this, I am always like this self starts to loosen. And there's something so touching about that to me. There's something so beautiful about, because I would never explicitly say that teaching, of course, or any of this in an MBSR class. But I particularly love watching that aspect unfold because I think it brings so much relief and space for people to be who they really are. And they discover it completely on their own. Every once in a while, maybe with just a gentle inquiry. Oh, I noticed that you said that you never do that. And then today you did. So what was that like for you? And there's a little twinkle, in eyes. And they kind of pause for a minute, because you've challenged this fundamental belief. Actually, I haven't challenged it. They've challenged it. I just reflect it back. So I don't know why that one in particular, Ted, but I think it's a really liberating teaching, and I see people come to it. I'm curious to see how you feel about that.
It's the same thing for me. And the reason, because I've thought about this a lot because of just challenges in my own practice, is that what this touches on as one in the tradition progresses and releases these blocks in their path and are growing. The most persistent one, the last one to really let go, is this sense of self, this identity. And the way I remember it as you were speaking, what echoed back to me was a memory of my 7-day with John and Saki years ago. And, at the time, these were very, very crowded, about 100 plus some people. And we were doing, it was towards the end, and the ask was for people to think of 5 words to share what this experience was like, or what you learned. And and literally hundreds of people did this. I remember only one person. It was a woman from Chicago. I remember that. It's a fellow Chicagoan. She stood up and she had this big smile on her face. And she was just glowing, and contrasting that from the beginning where there was more tightness. And by the end of this 7-day, this brightness. 5 words were, I am not my thoughts. And she counted them off on her hand, and she raised her hands up, and people applauded. And it was this wonderful moment of the recognition of that loosening of the conceptual ossified identity. To me, that was just like, wow, that's huge. And it was so beautiful to see and be part of just hearing that. That one always stuck with me.
So interesting. It's funny that we feel this because as I'm, now of course I'm kind of second guessing myself and going, well, really the second noble truth, the cause of suffering, craving. People get this right away when they're resisting the body scan or they're starting to see like, so yeah, no, it's the second noble truth. That's the predominant teaching. And of course it is so important when people start to see, what we sometimes call the second arrow of suffering. And they see that how craving and aversion are increasing their suffering. So I could have just as easily have said that or any number of other things, but I just have to go with what my gut went with the teaching on non-self. There's that great saying, you probably know who said it, one of the great sages who said, no self, no problem.
Well, our guest today has been Beth Mulligan, and you can find out more about Beth and her work. I will be linking this on the episode page for this episode at www.mindful-way.com. And of course, we'll be linking her book on the episode page, as well as a few of the others that we've mentioned here today. Beth, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Ted. It's really been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.